Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr., host of Reformed GGA, and today I'm going to be doing an initial impression video of the CZ P-10C. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and check and make sure that the gun is clear. First of all, we can see that there is no magazine in the gun. I can feel that there is no magazine in the gun. After that, we need to check the chamber. I can see that there is no round in the chamber. Give it a bit of shake before I stick my finger in there, and I can feel that there's no round in the chamber, so this gun is safe, and we can discuss it. Now, for those of you who know me, the fact that I'm holding this is probably a little bit of a surprise, because you know that, especially for a while now on the YouTube channel, I've been talking about double action, single action, and auto loaders, and one of my very first videos that I did in that series was talking about the advantages of double action, single action auto loaders, and one of the advantages that I listed of them is that they're usually safer than these guns are. When we talk about negligent discharges, accidental discharges, those kinds of things, negligent is usually a better descriptor for what actually happens. But cases where the gun goes off where the person really didn't want it to, the vast majority of the time, the culprit behind that is one of these, a striker-fired gun. And the basic reason for that is that at their core, striker-fired guns are not designed to either have an external safety or to have a very heavy trigger pull like double-action, single-action autoloaders have. And that was the primary means that we've used to achieve safety in most of the archetypical autoloaders that have been out there through history. So take, for example, a very famous autoloader, the 1911. It is a gun that is a single action only gun. You pull the hammer all the way back. It's in the ready condition all the time, and the only thing that keeps it from going off is the fact that you have the safety on, and hopefully you have it properly holstered. That is the safety for the gun, is that external safety that's on the side that you operate with your thumb. That proved not to be a very good idea for self-defense, because remembering to take off that safety properly is a tough thing for a lot of people to do in the heat of the moment. There's a lot of people that have wound up either with significant injuries, occasionally death, but handgun rounds usually don't kill all that often, especially in modern America. I think right now the stats are that you have like an 80% chance of surviving a handgun wound in America right now. Just because of the availability of medical care, and combined with the fact that handgun rounds are not nearly as powerful as a lot of other kinds of rounds. Most of your typical rifle rounds are far more effective than a handgun round. Most shotgun rounds, provided you're not talking about birdshot, instead you're talking about something like buckshot or slugs or something like that, those kinds of rounds out of shotguns are going to be much more effective than handgun rounds. So handgun rounds not overly effective. And generally in America we have pretty decent medical care. That combined makes your odds of surviving a handgun wound relatively high. So yeah, there have been cases where people have definitely wound up on getting the short end of the stick when they forgot to take the safety off their gun, but a lot of times they do wind up surviving, fortunately. But there are cases where, of course, something happens and the person who's defending themselves doesn't make it out. And sometimes it is because they weren't able to work their equipment appropriately, and that can involve not being able or not remembering to take off a safety when they needed to. And so after the introduction of the single action, double action autoloaders with 1911s and stuff like that, there was after that a transition to double action, single action autoloaders. And the idea behind them was to make something where you didn't need to have an external safety in order to keep the gun from accidentally going off. Instead, what you would do is you take this gun that's hammer fired and you would make it so that the trigger can't actually pull the hammer back as well as release it. On a single action gun, the trigger just releases the hammer to come forward. On a double action, single action gun, the trigger is such that when you pull it, if the hammer's forward, it can pull the hammer back as well as release it. So that's the double action, can pull it back and release. And so what you would do on those guns is you would decock the hammer, you would drop the hammer forward, and then the weight of the trigger pull of having to fight that hammer down, because the hammer spring is usually pretty powerful, the weight of having to pull that hammer all the way back for the first shot is basically what acted as your safety. Really first shot kept you from accidentally setting the gun off when you didn't intend to, but it made it so that the gun would work even under stressful conditions, and made it so that you didn't have to worry about disengaging a safety anymore. But it did create a major downside, and the major downside was that you would have an inconsistent trigger pull. Your first shot would be very heavy, and then the subsequent shots, because all the subsequent shots would be with the hammer all the way down, because the slide would push it down, those ones would be relatively light. So you have heavy first shot, light follow-up shots, and that is a little bit of a problem for some people. Now, me, all of the handguns that I have ever bought for myself have generally, there's one exception, but the vast majority of them, will say, have been double action, single action guns. The one exception is my PMR 30, and it's a single action only with an external safety, as most single actions are. But that is more of a recreational gun. I'm not saying that you can't use it for self-defense and that people haven't used it for self-defense, but it really wouldn't be my first go-to. It's not as reliable as a lot of other options out there, and it's also not as powerful as a lot of other options out there. Not saying it's completely insufficient, but really not preferable. But that is what I'm used to, and so the transition from double action to single action doesn't bother me too much, or at least I don't think it does. But the question is, if I had a gun that was designed to have a consistent trigger pull from the first shot going into the second and subsequent shots, would that actually improve my accuracy? And I'm not talking about the basic mechanical accuracy of standing there with a static target, taking all the time that you need to properly line up the shot and pulling the trigger and seeing how close to the bullseye you can get. What I'm talking about is accuracy at speed and with some kind of transition. Because a lot of times in a real world scenario, your target is going to be moving, maybe moving at you, and you're going to be able to need to transition, and you're going to have to be moving the gun while you're aiming and shooting, and you're going to have a time limit. Your time limit is that you need to do it quick enough that you're not going to be perhaps killed or greatly injured by this person who seeks to do you harm. And so the question is whether or not there's a gun type out there that would be better for that. The double action, single action autoloader was definitely an improvement over the single action autoloader, and that you don't have that external safety anymore. So yes, there's a much greater chance that you're going to be able to get rounds on target when you need them. But still, that transition from double action pull to single action pull can mess up your functional accuracy, your accuracy at speed, your accuracy with moving targets. So kind of the next generation of guns that came up after that were these striker-fired guns that this CZ P-10C represents. And the idea behind them is very similar to the double-action gun in that we're still trying to eliminate safeties. Now, there are some striker-fired guns out there that do have safeties, and part of the reason why those guns exist is just because some people really like to have safeties, and I understand why. I definitely do not want to have a negligent discharge of my firearm at all. I do not want to put anyone else at unnecessary risk. That is an unacceptable thing to do as a firearms owner, so I understand why they do that. But another reason, in addition just to having the safety itself, is that some people just simply like the action on a striker action gun. They prefer striker action guns. They believe that they're more reliable, or this, that, or the other thing. So they kind of want to have their 1911 but with a striker action. There's various reasons why people get guns, but as striker action guns were conceived of, they were conceived as being the next step in the iteration from single action with safety to double action with no safety. And now striker actions, a lot of them do not have safeties. This one does not have a safety. And the idea is that the trigger pull is always going to be consistent. And this trigger pull does not have a double action, single action difference. It is the same trigger pull every single time. And that is thought of being as an aid to your functional accuracy when you have to operate with a time limit, when you have to deal with a moving or transitioning target. Excuse me. That something that is going to have a consistent trigger pull is going to help. But there's still that issue of the two main safety features the autoloaders have had are removed in this gun. Traditionally, they've had either an external safety or a really heavy first trigger pull. This gun doesn't have either of those features, and that is why for the longest time I stayed away from these guns, because there is not that added level of safety to them. They are, in terms of trigger pull, oftentimes a little bit safer than a single action gun with no safety on. A lot of single action guns have relatively light triggers, a lot of times like 4 pound, 3.5 pound, 3 pound, sometimes 2.5 pound triggers. And if you don't put a safety on a gun like that, just simply bouncing up and down in a car with it on is sometimes, depending on the weight of the trigger itself and how much momentum you have going on there and how it's holstered and whatnot, can sometimes be enough to set it off. These kinds of guns usually come in a little bit heavier. They're, instead of like 4 pounds and under, they're usually 4 pounds and above. But it's still not a whole lot heavier, and so you can't really rely on the trigger as your main safety. And so there are some features that are built into it to kind of help out with that. There's some things going on internally to make the gun drop safe and things like that. And then as far as the trigger itself is concerned, there's this little trigger dingus that sits in the middle of the trigger, and you actually have to fully depress that before you can actually pull the main trigger. If that is not depressed, it locks up the trigger so that it can't fire. And the idea there is, if you have it bouncing up and down while you're in a vehicle or something like that, you don't want the weight of the trigger itself to set off the gun. And so you make it so that the trigger can't move unless that other piece is activated as well. But even with that added little feature and some of the drop safe stuff, things that they do inside of the striker action itself, there are still a whole lot of accidental and negligent discharges with these kinds of guns. And because of that, like I said, for the longest time I stayed away from them completely. However, the more research that I've done on the issue of accidental and negligent discharges with these kinds of guns leads me to the conclusion that most of the time, if not every single time, it's an issue of either just poor gun handling in general, people putting their trigger finger on the trigger when they're not supposed to, and those kinds of things, poor muzzle control, not following the 4 basic rules of gun safety, those kinds of issues. That's a big part of it, and that's going to be an issue with any gun. And then the other part of it that is usually much more specific to striker-fired guns is the issue of reholstering. A lot of times when you get negligent discharges with these guns, and it's not a basic 4 rules of firearm safety kind of issue, it's that the gun is not being put in the proper holster and the proper holstering technique is not being used. Most of the cases where I've seen that people have problems with these is with soft holsters of one kind or another. So fabric holsters, leather holsters, hybrid holsters that are soft on one side. Any combination thereof will sometimes result in problems. Not to say that happens all the time, but when you see problems with these kinds of guns, it's almost always associated with that kind of a carry system. So what the evidence would seem to indicate to me is that as long as you follow the 4 basic rules of gun safety, and if you have a good, rigid, solid holster, these guns can in fact be carried very safely, and you have the advantage of having a consistent trigger pull each time. So it meets the 2 basic criteria that I would have for a carry gun. Is I would definitely want it to be safe, and I would also want it to be effective if I ever had to use it. Now, I don't know if this is necessarily going to be more effective yet because I haven't had a chance to shoot it. Theoretically, on paper, having that consistent trigger pull would lead to being more functionally accurate, being able to operate at greater speeds, being able to transition better, etc., etc. But we'll see how that actually works out when I actually go and shoot it, so I don't know about that yet, but that's the theory behind it. Theoretically, this should be able to give me greater functional accuracy. we'll see how that actually is for someone who normally uses double action, single action guns. Now, I did talk about the holster aspect of this, and when you talk about striker fired guns like this, I think it really is important to talk about the holster. So let me go ahead and grab that for us here. Put my gun down for a second, put it in a safe direction, all those kinds of things, and we've already checked and see that it's clear. But I'll talk about the holster here for a second. This is a Galco, I think it's called a Triton inside the waistband holster, and as you can see, it's Kydex. It's completely solid. There is nothing soft about this at all. This is not fabric, this is not leather, this is not a hybrid holster of any kind. This thing is completely solid through and through. And I'll go ahead and stick the gun in there just so you can see how it fits. But it completely covers the trigger guard, and when it's in the holster, I cannot get my trigger finger in there at all, which is something that you definitely want for a striker fired gun. It's a good idea for any holster system, but especially for a striker fired gun, your basic safety is not on the gun anymore. Okay, that was what a double action gun was, is that the safety is on the gun and you have to deactivate the safety first. On a double action gun, the safety is basically on the gun. It's that double action first pull, that really long, heavy first trigger pull. On striker fired guns though, your safety is actually the holster. And so your holster is what is protecting the trigger from going off. And so your holster must absolutely cover that trigger guard and keep anything from getting in there. I can't wiggle a finger in there at all. It is solid, it is locked up. In addition to that, any kind of holster should have good retention in the sense of not allowing the gun to easily drop out of it. One of the things that happens in daily, everyday life is that you're going to have to go to the bathroom at some point. And you're going to have to undo your pants to go to the bathroom. At least most human beings are. You might be special, but the rest of us, we usually have to undo our pants. And what that means is that the holster is going to be sitting a little bit looser than it normally does, and it can start to flop around. And if that holster does not have a good solid grip on your gun can come flying out of the holster and possibly interact with something along the way, setting off the trigger, firing off a round that you didn't intend to, which can result in injury or death. Don't want that to happen, so your holster needs to retain the gun. So holding on the edges here, so I'm not clamping on the gun itself, this holster retains it quite well. Very, 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 very well. It does a good job of keeping that gun secure. So completely covers the trigger such that you cannot gain access to the trigger at all. It retains the gun such that it's not going to drop out if the tension in your waistband happens to be loosened up or anything like that. And then finally, for a good holster to work like it's supposed to in this situation, you need to be able to get a full firing grip on the gun. And I can get a full firing grip on the gun before I take it out of the holster, which means that I'm basically going to be ready to go. The only thing between this and a gun that's ready to fire is that this is still in the holster, and as soon as I take it out of the holster, it's ready to fire. The holster is my safety. And so when you think of striker fired guns, you need to always think of it as being paired with its holster. Okay. Every single bit of data on the issue that I've seen indicates that that's the case. The issue isn't actually different than it's been, and that there's always going to be some kind of a safety mechanism in place. The difference now is where we're putting the safety. It used to be an external button on the gun that you had to hit with the old single action guns with external safeties. And then they moved the gun, the safety, instead of external on the gun to internal to the gun. It makes you just have a really, really, really heavy first trigger pull. Well, now we've moved completely external to the gun altogether, and now the safety is the holster. Okay. Now this particular holster is not entirely perfect for this gun, I will admit. One thing, for example, that I wish that it did do that it doesn't do is I wish that it covered the magazine releases. It does not do that. That would be preferable. So far I haven't had any issues with that, and I'm much more concerned about it covering the trigger guard than I am that, but it would be nice if it covered the mag releases as well, which it doesn't do. And then on this mag release on this side, it actually was hitting, let's see if I can get this in the light properly for us here. It was actually hitting the top part of the holster. And so you can see this little part where the holster is actually raised and goes around. I actually did that with a file. I basically sanded it down or sanded it out so that the magazine release would fit in there without bumping into it anymore. And with these Kydex ones, that's fairly easy to do. It's basically just plastic, and so if you take a file and scrape on it, it's going to come off pretty easily. You're going to move material fairly quickly, and it's relatively easy to modify. Of course, I've completely voided the warranty on it, but that makes it functional for this gun. So yeah, this is the Galco Triton inside the waistband Glock 19 holster, and I loosened up the retention on it a little bit, made the little cutout for the magazine release on the other side, and now it works for my CZ P-10C and satisfies all the basic criteria that a good holster, and especially a good holster for a striker action gun, needs to adhere to. Alright, as to the gun itself, like I said, I haven't been able to shoot it yet, so I'm not entirely sure how that's going to turn out. But there are some interesting features that it has. One thing that I like about CZs in general is that CZs have good grips. They feel good, and they are typically very effective as well. There are some grips out there, for example, on a lot of Tauruses, that actually do feel pretty good in the hand, but you go to shoot the gun, you find out that that comfortable grip isn't actually really helping you any. On CZs, on the other hand, the grips are fairly comfortable, and they're also very effective. And one of the things that makes this particular handle very effective is the way that the stippling was done. On the sides, the stippling is not really stippling, it's actually these little square blocks that are not raised very high at all. It's actually relatively smooth on the side. And for a concealed carry gun that you're going to have the handle potentially pressing up against your side, you don't want it to be overly aggressive. And they did a good job of keeping that part down. But as we move to the back strap, you can see some actual stippling there. And this stippling is actually really quite aggressive on the back, and then you get similar stippling along the front. It's basically the same, it's just placed a little bit differently, but it's basically the same stippling on the front and the back. And the stippling on these, it's hard to see, but it's actually little squares that jut out of the handle, and there's quite a bit of space between them, and they themselves protrude quite far, and so it really digs into your hand when you go to hold it. In fact, when I first got this thing and I was messing around with it, putting some time on it, doing dry fire drills and things like that, it actually got to the point where I had a little bit of a rash on my palm just because of how abrasive that is. Now, it has worn down with time, and most guns that have this kind of an issue will do that. But yeah, initially it was actually a little bit frustrating. I was sitting there going, well, maybe I need to take some sandpaper to this or something like that. I wouldn't recommend that you do that. Most of the time, guns that have really aggressive stippling like that will wear down with a little bit of time, and that's exactly what happened with this one. You know, just kind of work through it, and either you'll develop a callus on your hand, or the little raised bumps will eventually wear down a little bit, and it'll be good. And this just locks up in the hand really nice and tight, very firm. Like I said, initially it was uncomfortable. It really dug into you, and I'll go ahead and release my hand here, and you can see the indentations on my palm right there. They're definitely fairly high, and like I said, initially it was enough that it actually gave me a bit of a rash, but now past that, and yeah, it still indents the hand a little bit, but it provides a really good solid grip. And those are the two main areas that you want to be grippy, because that's the action of the gun. It's going to move back and up, and so you want to have grip on the back and you want to have grip on the front to control that movement, and it does a very good job of that. So first win for the CZ P-10C is an awesome grip. It is both comfortable, and because of how they did the texturing, very effective for what it needs to be. Relatively light on the sides, much more aggressive on the front and on the back. Exactly what you need. This is not a handle that I plan on changing anytime soon. I don't plan on making any adjustments to it. I'm not going to put Talon grips on it or any aftermarket grips of any kind on it. And it does come with multiple back straps, but the small one I find works just fine for me. So I'm going to leave that be as well. It does have a little lanyard loop. I personally don't ever use those. For some people in certain circumstances it can be a good idea, but not a real big thing for me. But the first win on the gun is awesome grip. As we go up from the grip and we move into the magazine releases, that I would say is kind of a fail for CZ. They're not inoperable, but when I first got them, they were first got the gun, the releases were very stiff, and this is a solid bar that goes completely through the gun. So if I push on the back side, the opposite one moves through, and so that's how they make it ambidextrous. But it results in something that's really quite stiff, and like I said, out of the box it was very difficult to move. And the offhand one, the left-handed magazine release, is stiffer than the other one, and it can be very hard to move. Now, of course, doing a lot of drills with it, some of which would include magazines loaded with dummy rounds, where you're trading in and out with those. Eventually it did loosen up to the point where it's functional, but it is both kind of an awkward size. It's not all that easy to hit. You have to really be intentional about driving in, so you can't really roll off on it very easily. Have to be pretty intentional about it. And so I'm not a big fan of that, and I'm also not a big fan of that whole transfer bar system. You push in on one side, it pushes out on the other side, because it usually means that I'm pushing into my finger on the other side, and that doesn't feel overly great. It's not terrible, it doesn't keep me from being able to shoot or anything like that. It's just annoying that if I'm pushing with my thumb on one side, I can feel it on my middle finger on my other side, that it's there, and it's just annoying. So kind of a fail that way. It's functional, but the magazine release definitely could be improved. Alright, and then moving up from there, we have the beaver tail, and this is a striker-fired gun that really does have a pretty proper beaver tail on it. And I like that about CZs. Lots of CZs, if not pretty much all CZs, have some kind of a beaver tail, some kind of a tang on them that keeps you from getting too high and getting hammer bite or slide bite and those kinds of things. And that's frankly one of the reasons why I went with the CZ P-10C over the Glocks. The Glocks frankly scare me. I don't own one. I have shot those kinds of guns before. I can't remember if it was specifically a Glock or it was kind of a Glock-ass model, but one that had a very low slide relative to where the back of your hand is, and that frankly did not make me feel very comfortable. Me, I like to be able to get my hand as high up on the gun as I possibly can without worrying that I'm going to hurt myself in the process. Now, a certain amount of it I'll put up with. For example, my Bursa TPR-9C sometimes gives me a hammer bite. I've mentioned that in previous videos. But it's not super bad, and so I don't worry about it. I'm not going to change my grip because of it. I want to have a high grip first, and if it happens to lead to a little bit of slide bite or hammer bite, well then, such is life. You're going to bleed a little in life. It happens. But if you can avoid it out of the box, why not? And that's what this one allows. It's got a really nice deep notch in there, and so it keeps me pretty well away from that slide when it's open. And it gives me a lot more confidence that I would have with Glocks and guns that are like that relative to the slide versus where your hand is. So I do like that. That is a win. So far, good grip texturing, great beaver tail, not so great on the magazine release. Going up and forward from there, we have the slide stop, slide release, and it does technically function as both a slide stop and a slide release, but the way that it's situated, it doesn't really work all that great as a manual slide stop. The way that the handle is made is that it curves, that it bends out right at where the slide stop is, so it's basically a smooth transition from the handle onto the slide stop, so you can't really get under the slide all that well. So you have to be pretty concentrated on it in order to hit it right, and it does occur on both sides. But you've really got to think about pushing it on there. It's not really designed to be easily movable, and for me that is weird because I'm used to my Bursas. I have both a full-size Bursa and a compact, and the main controls on those are huge. They're very easy to get a hold of and press, and I can do offhanded manipulations with them just fine. They're awesome that way. But these are very, very, very flat, and they're basically made to be flush with part of the handle, and so the only way I can really get a hold of them is if I go up and then press in and then up again. It's not what I would call the most intuitive, especially for someone who's used to the huge controls on the Bursa. So that's awesome that way. And as far as using it as an actual slide release, I can get the slide to release with that. I'm not going to do that because that's actually kind of hard on the gun when you release without a round being chambered. I can get it to do it, but it's pretty firm, it's pretty stiff, and like I said, it's not nearly as easy as on the Bursas. What I've actually taken to do in my dry fire drills is I actually will hit the slide stop slide release from both sides, and then it's fairly easy to get it to go in. And then as far as bringing it out, pushing it with both sides tends to help with that as well. But it's pretty clear to me that CZ was not designing the gun to be run from the slide stop slide controls like other guns are. They were seem to be much more concentrated on operating everything from the slide itself than from the side controls. They're there if you need them, but it doesn't really seem to be their intention with the way that they designed it for you to overly rely on those. I think we're thinking that, you know, you'd rack around in with the slide, of course. When you get to last round hold open, you put the new magazine in, you just slingshot it, and slingshot it, pulling it the slide itself, and let that be. Not really worrying about using those slide stop slide release controls very much at all. I think that is fair to say. And then moving forward from there, of course, you get the trigger guard and the trigger. And the trigger guard is wonderful. I love CZ trigger guards in general, and that they both tend to be fairly spacious for like gloved hands and things like that. And I do occasionally wear fingertipless gloves, but you still get part of the glove around in there. And so having something that's big enough for that is important. I also love that the front is completely flat, and it does also have a little bit of texturing on it so that I can do my index finger grip on the gun. That is a grip that I'm very comfortable with. I like. It's very effective for me. So I like that this gun will allow me to do that. And then of course off of the trigger guard you have some thumb pads that have just a little bit of texture on them as well. Those are nice reference points. The trigger itself is kind of interesting. It's actually a very wide trigger. Don't know how well you guys can see that here. And it's just it's a very, very, very wide, flat kind of trigger. It is fairly round, but it still feels fairly wide. And of course it's polymer, it's plastic, and we've already checked and see that the gun is cleared, but it's polymer and it's plastic. And so there's a little bit of plasticky kind of creep to it. But and you go to pull, first little bit there's not much resistance at all. You get into kind of a wall, and then it's a little bit stagey, a little bit gritty. Then you get the release, and it's kind of a jump on the release. It's not at a specific break point, it's breaking. It's different for me. That seems to be fairly typical for a lot of striker fired guns, but for me, being a double action, single action gun guy, this is a little different. But then rack it, and then the resets on it, it starts to reset fairly quickly, but again it kind of pushes you out a little bit to basically the same place as on your first trigger pull in, to where you start to get a little bit of stacking. And that's what a lot of people like about striker fired guns, is that the first trigger pull and subsequent trigger pulls are basically the same. You're going to have to push back to the same point to start getting into the resistance. You're going to have to release to the same point to start getting into the resistance for the new shot. It's pretty consistent across the board. This one I did actually measure it. I finally broke down and got myself a true scale, trigger pull scale, and this one is pulling at 4 pounds 9 ounces now. Out of the box it was about 4 pounds 15 ounces. So lost a few ounces. Basically went from being a 5-pound trigger to a 4.5-pound trigger, just with a bunch of dry fire drills. Okay, all in all, not a bad trigger. And as far as gripping and looking at my sight picture and all that and seeing how steady it is through the trigger pull, it's actually surprisingly steady. It feels different for me because I'm a double action, single action guy, but it seems to be very stable. We'll see how it actually shoots when I get out there, but it seems like it's a very stable system, and it provides a very stable sight picture. While we're talking about the sights, I'm not a big fan of these ones. The sight picture is not terrible. It's just a simple 3-dot system, and the front dot is the same size as the back ones. I don't like that. I like it when the front one's bigger. But a bigger issue that I have with these ones is that these dots are the luminescent dots, so they glow in the dark and that kind of thing. But my problem with them is that in different lighting conditions, these can actually be really hard to pick up. If I have light to the back of the sights, if the main light source is behind me, they're not bad. But if the main light source is in front of me, it's basically just the notch and post that I'm looking at. And so that's not consistent. And if I have light above, I also can't pick up the sights overly well. And so they're kind of limited in that regard. Now there are plenty of aftermarket sights that are available for them. And so on this gun, while I will not be doing anything to the handle and grip at all, I can see myself changing out the sights. Just putting that out there. The sights seem to be fairly functional. Again, going out and testing it and actually shooting it in real-world conditions will tell us a lot more. They seem to be fairly functional, but those glow-in-the-dark sights have just never really done it for me. They're not good in different lighting conditions. If the lighting is just right, I can pick it up well enough that I'll get a good sight picture and be able to achieve suitable accuracy, but lots of times with sights like these, it's a little marginal for me. That might be just a personal issue, but yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the sights. They're not terrible, but not quite what I would be looking for. I would be much happier with either the tritium night sights, not because I intend to use them at night, but just because they tend to show up more consistently regardless of the ambient light conditions, whereas these kinds of sights tend to be much more dependent on the ambient light. Also, sights that I've had pretty good luck with has been the fiber optic sights, just because they tend to pull in a lot of surrounding light regardless of which direction that light is coming from. But these kinds of sights, not so much. Alright, and then while we're on the subject of accuracy, this, like pretty much all CZ pistols, came with a test target in the box, and it's one of the computer generated ones, so you're not actually getting the actual holes in the actual target, but one of the computer generated test targets. And either they changed some things at CZ, or the accuracy out of the box of this gun, or maybe more accurately before the box of this gun, is not stellar. The target that it came with was one that was shot at 15 meters, whereas all the CZs that I've gotten before this point were shot at 25 meters. Even guns that were comparable in size, for example my CZ75 Compact, which is roughly the same size as this, was shot at 25 meters. And it was such that basically all of the shots were kept within the 4-inch target circle, and it's mechanically a very accurate gun. I can't hit very well with it because the sights that are on it right now aren't all that great. Some point down the line I probably need to replace those. Not overly worried about it right now though. But mechanically, in and of itself, accurate gun. This one they only tested at 15 meters instead of 25, so it worries me that they brought it in, and one of the shots that was on the target wasn't in the 4-inch target circle. Now the average shot placement was inside of the 4-inch target circle, but one of them was not. And that just kind of worries me a little bit. There's lots of people that I've seen online test this thing, and a lot of them well, it's interesting. There will be a lot of people who will say, "Oh, this gun is so accurate, it's great," and then they'll actually show you some targets. Sometimes they won't show you the targets at all. They'll just claim that it's great, but then they'll show you the actual targets, and you look at it as like, "Well, that's not all that great. It's not terrible." But I wouldn't say it's an overly accurate gun based on the targets that they show. They say it's so accurate and so great, but you look at their targets like, nah, it's not really any better than a lot of other guns. In fact, most other guns. Nothing really to write home about. And then there will be people out there who say, I'm just having an off day and that's why I'm not shooting good with this, or I am accurate but the gun is off, maybe it came from the factory weird or something like that. But a lot of the things that I've seen online seem to indicate that the accuracy with these ones, the mechanical accuracy with them, is not as stellar as CZ is usually known for. Now I'll have to go and test it for myself and actually see how I do or don't do. But what I see with the test target that came with it, as well as what I've seen in a lot of other people's online reviews, indicate that this is probably not the most accurate gun in the world. I don't think it's insufficient for its intended purpose as a self-defense gun, but probably not going to be your next bullseye target gun either. Let's just be honest and fair. Alright, so there's that, and then let's go ahead and take it down. So like on most striker-fired guns, you pull the trigger. We already did that. Then there are some locking pieces. You pull down on those, pull back slightly on. It's hard to do it when it's like this. Okay. Pull back and in and off. Okay. Sorry I didn't get that on camera. I usually have to apply a little bit of back pressure to it, so I can't do it two-handed. Let's try and see if I can actually get it on camera this time. Alright, so pull trigger. And then with regard to the release tabs, pull back on those, pull back slightly on the slide and push forward. No. There we go. That still really wasn't all that on camera, but it is what it is. Alright, let's take a look inside. First thing that I noticed when I looked at it was that the lugs on the bottom of the barrel are huge compared to the slide. They pretty much span the full width. They are absolutely ginormous. The recoil spring and recoil guide rod assembly comes out as one. It's captured, which is somewhat nice. One thing that does bother me about it, though, is that this guide rod is some kind of a polymer or carbon fiber type rod deal. It is whatever it is, it's not metal. And so quality wise, that's not overly great for most people. In most situations, it's not going to make that big of a difference. But if I can get a metal guide rod, I do feel better with it. And there have been cases where these kinds of rods have failed. It's usually under fairly extreme conditions where somebody will have basically a full auto handgun and be running it at high rates with fairly high heat, and then these rods will melt. But most people, under most circumstances, they're not going to get it warm enough to melt through them or do anything that would significantly deform them, but I still don't like them, to be honest. Alright, then taking out the barrel here. Like I said, the chamber on that thing is very, very, very beefy compared to a lot of other guns, and the barrel itself is also fairly thick compared to a lot of other 9mm guns. So this gun really is made, as far as the barrel is concerned, it's made to take a pretty decent pounding. This is something that could, easily eat a relatively, not that CZ would had to claim this, but mechanically there's no good reason why this gun shouldn't be able to handle quite a few plus P rounds. The barrel is more than capable of it. So no major issues there. And then the slide assembly itself, most of it is pretty beefy and decent, with one major exception, and that is the rails. Don't know if you guys can, how well you guys can see that, but the rails are extremely thin by comparison to everything else. Most of the parts are pretty beefy, but that metal that connects the main part of the slide to the rails is extremely, extremely thin. And frankly, that does worry me a little bit. Now, I haven't had I've been able to come across any issues online of the rails breaking off or anything like that. So it doesn't seem to produce any major problems, but that definitely does surprise me that literally is just a little sliver of metal that's connecting the slide to the rails. That's not exactly confidence inspiring, just being honest. Now, of course, we'll have yet to see how it actually performs because I haven't got to shoot it yet, but that was surprising to me just because CZ usually has fairly beefy parts, and some of the parts in here were pretty beefy, but the gap, that little sliver of metal that connects the main part of the slide to the rails, just is not typical of CZ. So that's weird, but we'll see how it goes. And then as far as the frame is concerned, again, fairly standard for a striker action type gun. Fairly beefy parts, have forward mounted rails here, then rear mounted rails. You can see a little bit of shine that they've started to take just because I've been running the action manually quite a bit. Those kinds of things. A little bit of wear on the ejector, just because I do practice with dummy rounds and those kinds of things. Other than that, though, not bad. Fairly beefy, but just definitely had a little bit of wear in, but that's typical for a lot of guns, CZs and others, so not overly worried about that. Alright, now let's go ahead and put this thing back together, and it's basically just slide it on, rack it, and it's good to go. Alright, so that is the CZ P-10C, my initial impressions of it and thought behind it. Thought process behind it is fairly simple. I just wanted to test out the next generation of autoloader rather than the single action with safety versus double action, single action, the double action acting as the safety. You know, moving up to the next generation where the holster is basically your safety. So testing that out, see if it's going to be any more effective for me. Haven't test fired it yet. We'll see what happens. And then as far as the quality of the gun is concerned, a lot of it I like. Excellent handle and grip. Love the beaver tail. The trigger pull seems to be good and consistent. Doesn't change the sight picture much. Things like that. Love the trigger guard. I like the thumb pads with a little bit of texture on them. That's great. I love the forward cocking serrations and the rear cocking serrations. The sights are not terrible. Not my first preference, though. I don't like the glow-in-the-dark sights. An actual proper tritium night sight would be good, or some fiber optic sights would be good. These are just a little, there's better sights out there. So the sights are kind of a miss, or at least not as good as they could be. And like I said, the magazine releases are very stiff out of the box. Once you start putting magazines through it and whatnot, they do tend to loosen up a little bit, but still kind of stiff and not overly pleasant. Also, the slide stop slide release is not the easiest to get a hold of, especially for me being used to my Bursas with the huge controls that they have on them. So that is personally a little bit jarring for me. And then mechanically, the slide being joined to the rails, but that thin little sliver of metal that runs down the gun isn't overly confidence inspiring, nor is the carbon fiber guide rod that's holding the recoil spring in. I'm not sure if it's carbon fiber or whatever kind of polymer doodad it is. I think it's carbon fiber. Not impressed with those features. So there's some wins and there's some misses here, and I did get this on sale for like $400, so not a huge investment if it doesn't happen to work out. But I'm still kind of hoping that it does, because if it does, this is a fairly adaptable gun. The gun ships with 15-round magazines, but you can get extended baseplate adapters for them that will hold 17 rounds, and mine happen to come with the extended baseplate adapters. I usually don't go looking for them, but if it comes with it, might as well take advantage of it, so I can go from a 15-round gun to a 17-round gun with that. And then they do also make different kinds of barrels for these. Both CZ themselves do. CZ Custom will have them available. I think they're usually actual CZ parts that CZ Custom sells. And by the way, CZ Custom is a different entity. They specialize in adapting CZ guns, but they're a different entity. So they'll have aftermarket threaded barrels. CZ themselves will produce threaded barrels for the guns. And CZ Custom also makes different sights, of course, and there's lots of places that'll have different sights for them, but the one that I'm interested from CZ Custom is a Picatinny sight that you can put on your CZ P-10C, which means that you can put RMRs and things like that on there. So it's a very adaptable gun in that sense. I can, with an extended barrel and extended magazine, basically turn it into something that, as far as size and ballistic capability are concerned, would be very comparable to, say, a Glock 17. Or I can keep it in this configuration as something that's relatively small and compact that would be comparable to a Glock 19. And then if I want to get the Picatinny sight adapter, I have something that I can put a pistol red dot on. That's nice interchangeability and adaptability, and relatively low price to get in at. Like I said, on sale, about $400. The most expensive that I've seen for them I've seen them at in my area has been about $500. So a $400 to $500 gun is not hard to get into. And as far as pros and cons, I think the pros outweigh the cons at this point. I still want to see how it shoots, of course, but overall pretty decent, and I expect good things from the gun. There are things that annoy me about it, things that I don't think that are so great, but are not enough to keep me from trying to get out at least and seeing how it does for me. Anyways, that's been my little foray into striker fired guns. Hopefully I'll be able to shoot it soon. Bye-bye.